In a tense, silent briefing room, Avery Kade stands rigid before a table of grim-faced officers. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her weathered face as she maintains perfect military posture, despite the weight of accusation hanging heavy in the air. "Remove your jacket," the senior officer demands coldly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Avery's hand instinctively moves to her left forearm, a gesture so subtle most would miss it entirely. She pauses, her breath catching for just a moment, then slowly begins to unzip her field jacket. The sound seems unnaturally loud in the suffocating quiet. As the fabric falls away, all eyes lock onto her exposed arm. Someone in the shadows draws a sharp breath. Another officer leans forward, his face draining of color. "Dear God," someone whispers, voice trembling with recognition. The air freezes. What could possibly be hidden beneath Avery's quiet facade that would silence an entire room of hardened soldiers? What mark could carry such power that seasoned officers would react with shock and... is that reverence? The truth behind this moment will shatter everything you think you know about heroism and sacrifice, about the price some pay in silence, carrying burdens that others will never see or understand. Before we dive into Avery's incredible story, comment your city below, or simply type "respect" if you understand the power of silent heroes. Subscribe, hit like, and prepare yourself, because once you hear what really happened, you'll never see sacrifice the same way again. This is a story about 7 people who answered a call when others couldn't, about the one who survived to carry their memory, and about the moment when silence finally found its voice. Ready? Let's begin. 3 weeks before that fateful briefing room confrontation, Jamie Tran first noticed the woman who would change her understanding of heroism forever. Avery Kade moved through the supply depot like a ghost, efficient and nearly invisible. Her worn combat boots whispered against concrete while others clattered, and she worked in a bubble of focused silence that seemed to repel casual conversation. "She's been here longer than anyone remembers," Corporal Stevens whispered during inventory, nodding toward Avery as she methodically checked supplies. Nobody really knows her story. Jamie watched as Avery moved between towering shelves, her weathered field jacket hanging loose on her small frame. There was something about the way she carried herself, not swagger, but the careful, measured movements of someone who had learned to navigate the world without drawing attention. Her dark hair was always pulled back in regulation style, revealing a face marked by the kind of quiet weariness that came from seeing too much. The rumors followed her like shadows. "She's seen things," people would say. "Real combat." But when Jamie asked directly, responses were evasive. Avery's personnel file was surprisingly thin for someone who moved with such obvious military bearing, and her service record raised more questions than it answered. "Ever miss frontline action?" Jamie asked during a late-night inventory check, trying to break through the wall of silence. Avery's response was a shrug, her gaze distant as she continued counting medical supplies. "This is where I'm needed." The finality in her voice discouraged further questions, but Jamie caught something deeper, a flicker of pain, gone so quickly she might have imagined it. Jamie began noticing the details others missed. How Avery's hand unconsciously moved to her left forearm when thinking. How she positioned herself with clear views of exits. How she went completely still when helicopters passed overhead. Most telling was her response to crisis. When a young medic made a critical supply error that could have cost lives, Avery appeared at his side without a word, fingers flying across the keyboard as she quietly corrected the mistake. "Don't get involved," Sergeant Rodriguez warned later, noticing Jamie's curious glances. She keeps to herself for a reason. Some people carry things that are better left alone. But Jamie couldn't shake the certainty that Avery's careful distance from the world came from bearing marks that went deeper than skin. That night, she typed notes into her phone. Why does everyone avoid her? What's the story behind those scars? The photograph hit the base's private forum like a grenade on Tuesday morning. Grainy and taken from a distance, it showed Avery's left forearm during a brief moment when she'd rolled up her sleeve, revealing what looked like complex, scarred tissue. Stolen valor? Read the first comment, and within hours, the thread exploded into heated debate that divided the base. Some called for formal investigation, others defended her, but the damage was done. Jamie found herself in the middle of the storm during lunch break, surrounded by junior soldiers who had appointed themselves judge and jury. "I'm telling you, something doesn't add up," Private Morrison stabbed at his phone screen, his voice tight with conviction. "You don't get marks like that from logistics work. Either she's hiding something, or she's pretending to be something she's not." "Maybe she has a good reason for keeping quiet," Jamie shot back, her voice tighter than intended. "Maybe it's none of our business." The group turned on her with collective hostility. Morrison's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Oh, so now you're defending her? You're defending someone who might be lying to all of us. How does that feel?" "I know she's never asked for special treatment," Jamie replied, standing her ground despite the uncomfortable attention. "I know she does her job better than anyone else in that depot, and I know that spreading rumors based on a blurry photo destroys careers and lives." But her words fell on deaf ears. The controversy had taken on a life of its own, fed by boredom, jealousy, and the kind of mob mentality that could turn a military base into a pressure cooker of suspicion. The formal interviews began the following week. Jamie watched Avery being escorted to the administrative building 3 times in 5 days, each session lasting longer than the last. Despite mounting pressure, Avery continued working with the same quiet efficiency, but the strain showed in subtle ways. Perpetually tense shoulders, meals taken alone in the depot, interactions reduced to professional necessity. "Her paperwork doesn't match her behavior," Jamie overheard Colonel Martinez telling another officer. "Someone with her apparent experience should have a much more detailed service record. We need to get to the bottom of this." It was during this pressure cooker atmosphere that Jamie witnessed something that crystallized her growing certainty about her colleague. A veteran visiting for a routine appointment suffered a panic attack in the supply bay, triggered by the sudden roar of low-flying aircraft. While others stood frozen, uncertain how to help, Avery moved with swift, practiced precision. She guided the veteran to a quiet corner, her voice low and steady as she talked him through breathing exercises. "You're safe. Listen to my voice. Feel the ground beneath your feet. You're not there anymore." Her movements were those of someone who had dealt with this situation before, many times. The veteran's breathing gradually slowed under her steady guidance, his panic subsiding. Watching Avery's practiced response to someone else's trauma, Jamie began to understand that whatever secrets her colleague was carrying weren't about stolen valor or false claims. They were about something much deeper and more painful. The dreams began that night, fragments of imagination sparked by glimpses of Avery's hidden pain, images of flames and smoke, of people screaming, of someone small and determined dragging wounded soldiers through hell itself. "Isn't anyone interested in the truth?" Jamie found herself asking Sergeant Rodriguez the next morning, frustration bleeding through her professional composure. Rodriguez's expression was grim. Sometimes the truth is more complicated than people want to deal with, Tran. Sometimes it's easier to believe the worst than to dig deeper. The summons came on Friday afternoon, calling Avery to an official personnel review that would change everything they thought they knew about the quiet woman who had worked beside them for so long. The conference room felt like a tribunal, its beige walls closing in as 5 officers arranged themselves behind the polished mahogany table. The fluorescent lights above cast everything in harsh relief, making the shadows under Avery's eyes appear deeper as she sat alone in the single chair facing them. The air was thick with the weight of formal military justice. Colonel Martinez opened the thick folder before him with deliberate ceremony. "Specialist Kade," he began, his voice carrying the formal weight of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. "You understand that misrepresenting military experience is a serious offense." Avery's response was barely above a whisper, but her voice carried clearly in the still air. "Yes, sir." "The allegations brought forward suggest that you may have misrepresented your service record to obtain your current position." Martinez's eyes never left her face. The photograph that sparked this investigation shows what appears to be significant scarring, suggesting combat experience not reflected in your official record. The door opened softly, and Jamie entered, her face pale but determined. She had been called as a witness, one of the few people who had worked closely enough with Avery to provide testimony. Colonel Martinez nodded toward a chair along the wall. "Miss Tran, please remain silent unless directly questioned." Jamie took her seat, her heart pounding as she watched Avery's carefully controlled expression. Even now, facing potential court-martial, the woman showed no signs of breaking down or offering excuses. There was something almost noble about her composure, a dignity that made the accusations seem somehow smaller and more petty. "Before we proceed," Martinez continued, "I'm going to ask you to remove your jacket and roll up your left sleeve." The request hung in the air like a challenge. Jamie found herself holding her breath, suddenly aware that whatever happened next would change everything they thought they knew about the quiet woman who had worked beside them for so long. Avery stood slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. She shrugged out of her field jacket with practiced precision, folding it carefully before placing it on the back of her chair. Her uniform shirt revealed arms that were thinner than Jamie had expected, but corded with the kind of lean muscle that spoke of functional strength. With a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs, Avery began to roll up her left sleeve. The fabric moved slowly, revealing first the pale skin of her wrist, then the beginnings of what looked like deliberate scarring. But as more of her forearm became visible, the room fell into absolute silence. It wasn't just scarring, it was a tattoo transformed by fire and trauma. A raven in flight, its wings spread wide, surrounded by 7 small stars. But the entire image was overlaid with raised keloid scars that caught the fluorescent light, making the raven appear to move across her skin like a living thing, emerging from her very flesh. Colonel Martinez went pale, his hands trembling as he leaned forward to get a better look. "Dear God," he whispered, his professional composure cracking. "The Raven Hill fire." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Jamie saw the other officers exchange glances, their expressions shifting from suspicion to something approaching awe. Even she, with her limited knowledge of military history, recognized the name. Raven Hill had been a classified disaster, buried so deep in military bureaucracy that most people only knew it as a whispered legend. "That mark," Martinez continued, his voice hoarse with emotion, "it's not regulation. It's not official. It's..." He paused, struggling for words. It's a graveyard of memories. Avery's voice, when she finally spoke, was steady but carried the weight of years of silence. We made them ourselves, sir. The 7 of us who went in. We knew not all of us were coming back. The story that emerged over the next hour was nothing like what Jamie had imagined, and yet it explained everything she had observed about Avery's behavior. The Raven Hill incident had been a medical evacuation mission during a classified operation. A transport helicopter carrying wounded soldiers had gone down in hostile territory, and the official rescue mission had been deemed too dangerous to attempt. But 7 medics had volunteered anyway, knowing that the wounded men would die without immediate medical attention. They had gone in against orders, carrying supplies and hope into what everyone knew was likely a death trap. The improvised tattoos had been their way of ensuring that if they didn't make it back, at least they would be remembered as a unit. The fire started when we were loading the wounded, Avery continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke, her thumb tracing the scarred raven on her forearm. Fuel leak, probably hit by small arms fire. The whole bird went up in seconds. I was the only one who made it out. Me and 3 of the wounded we managed to drag clear before the ammunition started cooking off. Colonel Martinez had remained standing throughout her account, his face grave. According to the official record, all 7 medics were listed as KIA. The mission was classified, the details buried. I was a lieutenant then, part of the investigation team. He looked directly at Avery, his eyes bright with unshed tears. We looked for survivors for 3 days. We found remains, but the fire was so intense, identification was impossible. I was in a field hospital for 4 months, Avery said quietly. Burns over 60% of my body. When I was stable enough to be moved, they told me the mission had never officially happened, that my unit had been declared dead, that it would be easier for everyone if I just disappeared into the system. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of someone clearing their throat roughly. The accusations that had brought them all to this room suddenly seemed not just wrong, but obscene. Here was someone who had sacrificed everything, who had been erased from history to protect classified operations, being accused of stolen valor by people who had never faced a fraction of what she had endured. I'm no hero, Avery whispered, her voice barely audible. I just couldn't leave them behind. The wounded, I mean. They were counting on us, and we were all they had. She rolled her sleeve back down, covering the scarred tattoo that had become both monument and burden. I never asked for recognition. I just wanted to keep serving, even if it had to be in the shadows. Jamie felt tears streaming down her face, understanding now why Avery had seemed so familiar with trauma, why she moved through the world with such careful dignity. She wasn't hiding from her past. She was carrying it every single day, in silence and without acknowledgement. Colonel Martinez slowly sat back down, his hands shaking as he closed the folder that had started this entire nightmare. Specialist Kade, he said, his voice thick with emotion. On behalf of the United States Army, I want to apologize. What happened to you and your unit should never have been forgotten. Your service, your sacrifice, it deserves to be honored, not questioned. But Avery was already shaking her head. The dead don't need honors, sir. They need to be remembered. And the living, we just need to keep serving. The transformation began within hours of the personnel review, words spreading through the base like ripples in still water. Not through official channels. The details of Avery's service record remained classified, but through the kind of whispered conversations that carry more weight than any formal announcement. Jamie found herself at the center of these conversations, one of the few people who had been present for the revelation. She chose her words carefully, respecting both the classified nature of the information and the dignity of the woman who had endured so much scrutiny. But she made sure that people understood the basic truth. Avery Kade was not a fraud or an imposter. She was a genuine hero who had been forgotten by the very system she had served. Anonymous notes began appearing on Avery's desk the next morning. Simple pieces of paper carrying messages that ranged from formal apologies to heartfelt expressions of gratitude. "I'm sorry I doubted you," read one. "Thank you for your service," said another. "You make us all proud to wear the uniform." Avery read each note carefully, her expression unreadable, before filing them away in her desk drawer. She didn't seek out the people who had written them, didn't demand public apologies or acknowledgments. She simply continued with her work, the same quiet efficiency that had always characterized her approach to military service. But the changes were visible to those who looked. The way other staff members now nodded respectfully when Avery passed. How conversations would pause when she entered a room, not out of suspicion, but out of something approaching reverence. The base forum thread that had started the controversy was quietly deleted, replaced by a simple message about the importance of supporting fellow service members. Private Morrison, who had been one of Avery's most vocal critics, approached Jamie during lunch 3 days after the revelation. His face was flushed with embarrassment, his usual swagger replaced by genuine remorse. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just to you, but I don't know how to face her. What I said, what I assumed, it was wrong on every level." Jamie studied his face, seeing the genuine distress there. "She's not looking for apologies," she said finally. "She never was. She just wanted to do her job in peace." "But how do you live with yourself after something like that?" Morrison asked. "How do you just keep going?" It was a question that Jamie had been asking herself, and she was beginning to understand that the answer lay in the very ordinariness of Avery's daily routine, the quiet dignity with which she approached even the most mundane tasks, the way she had chosen service over recognition, contribution over glory. Colonel Martinez worked quietly behind the scenes to address the institutional failures that had led to the situation. The base leadership organized a discreet memorial service in the logistics wing, not a grand ceremony that would draw unwanted attention, but a simple gathering that honored both the fallen and the survivor who had carried their memory alone for so long. The memorial itself was modest, a small plaque mounted on the wall near the supply depot, bearing the words, "In memory of the Ravenhill 7. They answered the call when others could not." No names were listed, in keeping with the classified nature of the mission, but those who knew understood the significance. Avery stood before the plaque during the brief ceremony, her scarred hand resting gently on the bronze surface. She didn't speak. She rarely did during public gatherings, but Jamie saw her lips move in what might have been a prayer, or simply the names of the friends she had lost. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sound of aircraft and the everyday bustle of a military base going about its business. When Colonel Martinez approached her afterward with an offer of rank restoration and public commendation, Avery's response was characteristically direct. "Recognition can't heal what we lost, sir, and it can't bring back the people who should be standing here instead of me." But Jamie saw something in her colleague's eyes that hadn't been there before. Not happiness, exactly, but perhaps a kind of peace. The weight of carrying her secret alone had been lifted, replaced by the knowledge that her service, and the service of her fallen comrades, was finally understood and honored by the people around her. The changes in the base culture were subtle but significant. People began to look beyond surface appearances, to consider that everyone carried stories that might not be immediately visible. The casual gossip and speculation that had fueled the controversy around Avery became less common, replaced by a more thoughtful approach to understanding their fellow service members. Months later, as Jamie led a new cohort of logistics interns through their orientation, she found herself pausing at the memorial plaque that had become a quiet landmark in the logistics wing. The group was young, eager, and filled with the kind of nervous energy that came with starting a new chapter in their military careers. "This memorial," she began, her voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom, "represents something important about military service. It's not just about the people who are officially recognized or whose names appear in history books. It's about all the quiet heroes who serve without recognition, who carry burdens that others will never see or understand." One of the interns, a young man barely out of high school, raised his hand tentatively. "Ma'am, what happened to the Ravenhill 7? Jamie chose her words carefully, respecting the classified nature of the mission while conveying its essential truth. They were medics who volunteered for a mission that everyone knew was extremely dangerous. They went in to save wounded soldiers when the official rescue was deemed too risky. Only one of them made it back, and for years, her service was forgotten by the very system she had risked everything to serve. She gestured toward the depot where Avery could be seen working at her usual station, methodically checking inventory numbers with the same focused attention she brought to every task. That survivor worked here, among us, for years. She never sought recognition or special treatment. She just wanted to continue serving, even if it had to be in the shadows. The interns followed her gaze, studying the small woman who had become something of a legend on the base. Avery looked up from her work, catching sight of the group, and offered a brief nod of acknowledgement before returning to her tasks. There was nothing dramatic about the moment, nothing that would suggest the depth of sacrifice and service that her presence represented. "The lesson here," Jamie continued, "isn't about heroism in the traditional sense. It's about the meaning of service itself. Real service isn't about glory or recognition. It's about showing up day after day and doing what needs to be done, regardless of whether anyone notices or appreciates your efforts." As the weeks passed, Jamie watched the new interns gradually come to understand what she had learned during those difficult months of controversy and revelation. They began to notice the small acts of kindness and competence that characterized Avery's daily routine. The way she would quietly assist struggling colleagues without being asked. How she seemed to anticipate problems before they became crises. The calm, steady presence she brought to even the most chaotic situations. The culture of the base had shifted in subtle but profound ways. People were more likely to offer help without being asked, more willing to look beyond surface appearances to understand the deeper currents that drove their colleagues. The casual gossip and speculation that had once been common became less acceptable, replaced by a more thoughtful approach to understanding and supporting fellow service members. On a particularly quiet afternoon, Jamie found herself working alongside Avery in the supply depot, both of them focused on the endless task of inventory management. The work was routine, even mundane, but Jamie had learned to find meaning in the ordinary tasks that kept the base functioning. "You know," Jamie said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I used to think that real military service was about combat, about the dramatic moments that make headlines." Avery looked up from her clipboard, her expression curious but patient. But I've learned that most service is like this, Jamie continued, gesturing to the orderly rows of supplies around them. It's about showing up, doing the work, taking care of the people around you. It's about being reliable when others are counting on you, even when no one is watching. Avery nodded slowly, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The dramatic moments get the attention, she said quietly. But it's the everyday moments that make the difference. The choice to keep serving, even when it's hard, even when no one notices. As the afternoon sunlight streamed through the depot windows, Jamie watched Avery trace her finger along the edge of her scarred forearm, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. The scar was no longer hidden, no longer a source of shame or suspicion. It had become what it had always been intended to be, a memorial to fallen friends, a reminder of the price of service, and a symbol of the strength that could emerge from even the most devastating trauma. The real legacy of the Ravenhill 7 wasn't in any official record or formal ceremony. It was in the quiet example of their survivor, who had chosen to honor their memory through a lifetime of faithful service, who had turned her pain into purpose, her trauma into a tool for helping others, who had demonstrated that true heroism wasn't about single moments of dramatic action, but about the daily choice to keep serving, keep caring, keep showing up for the people who needed you. In the end, Jamie realized, that was the most important lesson of all. Service wasn't about recognition or glory. It was about the willingness to give of yourself, day after day, for something larger than your own needs and desires. It was about the quiet strength to carry on, even when the weight seemed unbearable. And it was about the understanding that every person you served alongside carried their own stories of sacrifice and service, deserving of respect and recognition regardless of whether their contributions were visible or officially acknowledged. As the sun set over the base, casting long shadows across the supply depot, Jamie felt a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons she had learned and the example she had been privileged to witness. The story of Avery Kade and the Ravenhill 7 would stay with her always, a reminder that true service was measured not in moments of glory, but in years of faithful dedication to something greater than oneself. If you know someone whose sacrifice was never seen, share their story below. Subscribe for more true tales of service and resilience. Because sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who serve in silence, carrying their burdens with dignity, waiting not for recognition, but simply for the chance to keep serving others.